Let's get you back to running with proximal hamstring tendinopathy. When looking at the demands of running, there's a couple of things to know when we're dealing with proximal hamstring tendinopathy. The first thing is that the range of motion in the hip when we're actually running is relatively small. Of course, we get some flexion and extension of the hip, but we're not going to so much hip flexion that we have to be too concerned about the actual compression that we're putting on the tendon. But when we look at the demands of running, we do see that there's some spikes of load on the hamstring during the running cycle, specifically during the swing phase, as well as initial contact where our foot actually hits the ground. So when we're building a rehab program for proximal hamstring tendinopathy, we want to make sure that we're accounting for these things so that way the tendon's able to tolerate them when we go back to running. And so obviously if we've gotten to the stage where we're thinking about returning back to running, we've probably already done a progressive loading program for the proximal hamstring tendon. That way we have some general strength before we actually start going into running. And so what we need at this point is some specific things to kind of help us with those demands of running. For this video, I'm going to break it up into a couple of different sections. The first section is going to focus on the swing phase, so that way we're going to do some exercises to build up the tendon so that it can tolerate those demands. Then we're going to go into the stance phase because the demands are a little bit different, so the exercises are going to change. And then at the end, we're going to do some integrated exercises where we kind of bring everything together so that way we feel confident when we get back into running that our tendon's going to be able to tolerate it. For the swing phase, a great place to start is with marching, and we're just trying to get the lower body and the hamstring used to some of the movements of running. So what we'll do is we'll just start in a nice standing position here with the torso upright, and we're going to lift our leg up just so it's a little bit off the ground, switch, and then go back to the other side. And so we're not actually jogging in place. We want to do this nice and slow and controlled here, just so we can kind of go through some of the movements of running. And what you'll also notice is that I'm not bringing my hip into too much flexion because we're not preparing to go back to sprinting. We're just trying to get used to the movement and eventually start to get back into jogging and running. So when we're doing it, it's just high enough where our foot's off the ground, almost like you're stepping up onto a curb and then switching sides. And so again, just nice and slow. We don't have to go too fast, just to get used to the movement. Once we're able to tolerate marching, then we can progress the exercise to include an exercise band. And so I have the exercise band wrapped around my ankle, and then it's going to be anchored out in front of me. If we need to in the beginning for a little bit of balance, we can use a wall or a chair or something like that. Ideally, we actually don't need that balance and we're able to stabilize on our own, but in the beginning, because we're just getting started, feel free to use something to help you. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go back into that single leg stance here. And the first movement is we're just going to work on flexing and extending that knee. So we're just adding a little bit of resistance to the hamstring here. And so we're getting closer and closer to what running actually looks like for the hamstring. We can also change this so that we're actually just working on extension, which will actually get a little bit more of that proximal hamstring involved. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to do kind of like a kickback, basically, where we're just working on squeezing the glutes, getting a little bit of that hamstring to work on that extension strength. We don't have to go all the way back into extension just because running, we don't really extend the leg that far back, but it's good to build a little bit of tolerance. So we don't want to just kind of go too neutral. We want to go back into a little bit of extension once it's tolerated. Finally, we can increase the difficulty of this exercise to actually kind of looking more like that running cycle. And so what we're going to do is we're going to come up and then kind of just go in a circular pattern here. And so it kind of looks like I'm riding a bike, but this is kind of what it looks like when we're actually running. So we're just getting the hamstring used to that dynamic range of movement that we're going to experience when we're running. Now let's get into some exercises to help with the stance phase. As mentioned before, there's not a whole lot of hip flexion when we're jogging, so we're not too concerned about the compressive loads between the hamstring and the ischial tuberosity, but the hamstring does have to absorb some of the forces when we make contact with the ground when we run, so let's build up that tolerance. So to start, we can use a mini split squat to start exposing the tendon to some of those demands that we'll experience during that stance phase of running. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to have, this is the leg that I'm going to be focusing on, and then we're just going to have our feet split slightly apart. I'm actually trying to be a little bit more over top of my foot. I don't want to be too far out here because if we're running like this, we're overstriding. So we actually want to have that foot a little bit underneath us. It's okay if it's a tad bit in front. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go through that small range of motion that we'd actually be exposed to when we're actually making contact with the ground. So we're just going to drop just a little bit here and then come back up. And so initially we can go nice and slow. We don't have to go too fast. Once we are able to tolerate it, we can speed it up just a little bit because as we're kind of jogging, obviously we're going to be taking a lot of steps. And then once we're actually able to tolerate this, then we can actually add a step in which kind of looks like one step of running. So what that would look like is I'm going to start here, and then I'm going to come and take a step, and then we can come back into this position here, and then just repeat that nice and slow. So we're working this leg through that dynamic range again, and just adding in just a little bit of movement. So this is actually probably a little bit more than we'd actually experience when we're running, because obviously we don't have our knees bent this much when we're running, but we're just building that capacity so it'll be able to tolerate the movement. And then we can progress that mini split squat into a variation of a single leg squat. Obviously we don't have to go into a full pistol squat because that's not what we're going to be experiencing when we're running, but going into a single leg variation will help expose the tendon to some of those demands that we're actually going to experience with running, because when we think about running, it's really just hopping from one leg to the other. And so what we're going to do is we're going to be in that single leg position here, and then all we're going to do is just do the same thing that we did for that mini squat. And so we're going to start off nice and slow. We don't have to go all the way down like I was saying, but we just want to get comfortable in this position. So we're adding a little bit of hip flexion in here, but this is really what we're going to do, because if we think about running, I would go from here and then hop onto my other foot. So we're just working on building up the tolerance in this position, and then as we get more comfortable, we can speed it up, because when we think about running, it's a much quicker hop from each side, so we just want to get used to that position. And then the final progression that I like to use is some variation of a mountain climber, because it really simulates the movement of running, so it gives us a good indication of how we're going to tolerate those loads. And so we can start off with an incline mountain climber, which will take a little bit of the load off of the lower body. And so in the beginning, we don't have to worry about moving quickly. We can just work on similar to that march in the beginning here. I'm just bringing the leg up and then switching nice and slow here. We want to try to have a nice straight angle here, so it's almost like a plank as well. We don't want to be bending through the upper body too much, because that might add a little bit of compression on that tendon. So we want to have a nice straight line basically between my stance leg all the way up to my shoulder here, and then just switch sides nice and slow. And then we can progress that incline mountain climber to mountain climbers on the ground. And when I do this, initially I like to use furniture sliders to help decrease the impact on the lower body. So that way we're just working the lower body through the range of motion that we'd experience during running without worrying about some of the impact. And so remember that when you're in that mountain climber position, we want to be in a plank so our hips aren't too high up, because that's not how we're going to run. And so we want to be in a nice position here. We don't have to worry about bringing our hips too high up, because again, when we're running, we're not going to have that amount of hip flexion. We just want a little bit of movement through the lower body. So what it'll look like is we could start off nice and slow here, and then as we feel comfortable, we can increase the speed, and then we can remove those furniture sliders so that way we're increasing the impact on the lower body. And now we're really kind of just simulating how we're running, but in a horizontal position. All right, so let's say we're able to do all those exercises and we're feeling good, we're ready to get back to running. There's a couple of considerations that we should take before actually starting running. The first is on programming. For some with proximal hamstring tendinopathy, it might have been a couple of months or even a couple of years since the last time we did cardio. And then for some, we might be just nervous about actually returning back to running. Maybe every time we've tried to go back to running, it's irritated the tendon, or maybe that's how we aggravated it in the first place. So when we're actually getting back into running, we want to make sure that we're not just going out and doing a marathon and then just overloading the tendon again and just kind of irritating everything all over. And a popular strategy to achieve this is doing some sort of run-walk program where we're gradually increasing the loads on that hamstring tendon. So for example, we might start off with a 10 to 30 minute brisk walk where we're walking a little bit faster than we would normally. And then once we're able to do that, then we'd start incorporating some intervals where we're doing maybe a 1 minute jog followed by a 4 minute walk. And then we would do several cycles of that. Once we're able to do that, then we would do 2 minutes of jogging followed by 3 minutes of walking, and so on and so forth until we're able to run for a prolonged period of time. And there's not a set criteria of when to progress, so it's not like every 2 weeks we should increase the interval so we're doing 1 more minute of running per cycle. It really depends on the individual's tolerance to load. So for some, we might stay at a certain interval for a little bit longer to build up that tolerance, and that's okay. We just want to slowly build up that tolerance so eventually we're getting back into just our normal runs. And the next consideration is actually our technique with running, and there's a ton of different stuff that we could talk about here, but the 2 main things that I want to talk about are the torso position as well as your cadence. And you probably noticed in a lot of the exercises that we covered that I was talking a lot about torso position and trying to stay upright or kind of like in that plank position. And the reason why is because if we're running with a forward lean, so instead of running here, we're running like this, we can see that our hips are going to be in a little bit of flexion, which might put a little bit of compression on that hamstring tendon. And then as we take each step, it's going to increase that compression a little bit more. So when we run, we want to run with that nice tall spine. So that way we're upright, and that way we're just not going into that hip flexion, which might be irritating when we start to add a little bit of load to that hamstring. And then finally, let's talk about our cadence or our step rate when we run. And when we get back into running, we actually want to have a little bit faster cadence when we start running. And the reason why is because if we take too slow of a cadence, we tend to have longer strides to make up for that, which can sometimes lead to overstriding, which just means that our foot is landing too far in front of our body. And that puts a little bit more stress on that hamstring tendon that we don't necessarily need to. And so when we take quicker steps, we decrease that stride length so that way our foot is landing a little bit closer to right underneath us when we run, and it helps to control some of that load that we're placing on the hamstring. So when we're running, we want to take a little bit quicker, smaller steps. That way we're able to control that load that we're placing on the hamstring. So hopefully this video was helpful in returning back to running with proximal hamstring tendinopathy. If it was, give this video a big thumbs up. It'll help with the algorithm so that other people with proximal hamstring tendinopathy can get back to running as well. Also, leave a comment down below. I know that dealing with proximal hamstring tendinopathy could be a pretty frustrating condition. And so let's leave some positivity in the comments there so that way it'll inspire other people with proximal hamstring tendinopathy to get back into running. I'll see you guys in the next video.